Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Cara. It's wonderful to see you all. So my name is Jared Duvall. I serve as EAN's Executive Director.
And hi, everyone. My name is Lena Steer. I am EAN's Data Manager and Research Analyst.
And we together are going to share with you the key findings of the just released 2023 Annual Progress Report for Vermont. But before we do that, we want to stop to thank some key people who made the production of this report possible. First, I want to thank Lena, who just started with EAN in January, and as she started, we were beginning the production of the report, and really for the last 9 months, Lena has expertly, in a dedicated way, managed the production of this report, and it's been amazing. So first and foremost, thanks to Lena for her work in doing this. Thank you also to Cara for being an integral part of creating this report, as together as a staff, we've collaboratively designed and authored the report as a staff team. The report, as many of you know, draws on data that was provided to us by state, utility, and nonprofit partners. Thank you all so much for that sharing and collaboration. We could not produce this without you. And we also want to thank the more than 30 people, most of whom I believe are in this room, including data providers, EAN senior fellows, board members, and others who reviewed and provided feedback on initial drafts of the report. So as I said, we're really just going to share the key findings. There is a lot more in there, but as we go, if you have any questions, please feel free to just enter them into Slido as we go. And we won't actually pause to take those questions. We're going to go through the key findings, but then we'll address any questions that have been logged in there when we get to the end. So we're going to start here. This is a page early in the report, our first key finding, and it's really meant to give us a chance to step back and put in context, where does Vermont stand relative to the climate commitments we've made, the science-based climate commitments we've made. And you can see this line here, this green dotted line represents a 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels. That is the commitment that the United States made as part of the Paris Agreement, and that same target is reflected in Vermont state law with the Global Warming Solutions Act. Many states are working to do their part towards the Paris target that we've made nationally. And unfortunately, as of the latest data, the most recent year for which we could get greenhouse gas emissions data from every state in the region is 2019. Vermont has made the least progress towards the Paris Agreement commitment of any state in the Northeast, 11% below 2005 levels. And if you look above the top half of this graph, it compares our per capita emissions with our neighbors, both in New England and in the Northeast. For reference, on the far left here, we can see the United States per capita emissions, and here we can see global. And what we find is that Vermont has the second highest per capita emissions in New Hampshire as of 2019, behind or lower only than New Hampshire. And that if we extend the comparison to the entire Northeast, Vermont has the third highest per capita emissions, with only Pennsylvania and New Hampshire being higher. So this just helps provide the context of where do we stand, what is the scale and pace of work that is still before us to meet this national commitment, our legal obligations, our moral responsibility, and more.
This question of per capita emissions and Vermont's relative responsibility to act on climate are some of the topics that we explore in a more recent research paper that we released last week alongside the annual progress report. And we have copies of the executive summary available up at the registration table if anyone's interested, but it's also up on the EAN website now. So in addition to comparing the total per capita emissions between states, which Jared just talked about, this research paper also digs into where these emissions are coming from. So this graph shows per capita emissions broken down by sector for all of the states in New England. It might be a little bit difficult to read the states at the bottom there, but I'll point out some of them for you. So we can see that in most of these states, the transportation and thermal sectors, which are shown in green for transportation and orange for thermal, are the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And Vermont's transportation and thermal sectors emissions are both the second highest per capita in New England. So you can see that in this bar here. And only New Hampshire has higher transportation emissions than Vermont, and only Maine has higher thermal emissions than Vermont does. And on this graph, you can also see electricity sector emissions. That's shown in blue here. So Vermont's, you can see, is very small relative to the other states, but that kind of gap is made up by the agriculture sector, which is right here. But we can see that New Hampshire's per capita electricity sector emissions are much higher than the rest of the states, and this is largely due to differences in electric sector policies. So New Hampshire has the weakest renewable portfolio standard in New England. And then we also extended this comparison beyond this small region of the United States to see where Vermont stands relative to the rest of the world. So while Vermont's per capita emissions are lower than the US as a whole, which is shown in this very top orange bar here, our state's per capita emissions are much higher than most other countries in the world. And in fact, our per capita emissions are actually more than 2 times higher than the global average, which you can see on this vertical dotted line here. And that is just over 6 metric tons of emissions per person. Average. And additionally, Vermont's per capita emissions are much higher than many other major world economies, or other than the US. So you can see like China is here at 9.6, and then going all the way down to India at the bottom. You can't really see the bar there, unfortunately, because of the colors, but And when we look at historical emissions over time as well, we can see that places like the US and Canada, which are shown on these top 2 lines up here, have, they don't just emit more on a per capita basis today, but have also had far higher per capita emissions over time. So this graph is showing back to 1960, but that trend of having higher per capita emissions for decades has contributed to these same countries having significantly higher total cumulative emissions as well. And we can think of total cumulative emissions as the extent to which a state or a country has played a role in producing or contributing to the climate destabilization that we see today. So the United States, which has relied pretty heavily on burning fossil fuels for nearly 2 centuries, is actually responsible for over 20% of total global cumulative greenhouse gas emissions since 1850. So about a fifth of total cumulative emissions. And as part of this research, we calculated an estimate of Vermont's total cumulative emissions since 1850 as well. And that it's not shown on this graph yet, but we found that our state has produced more emissions on a cumulative basis than over 70 countries around the world. And many of those countries have much larger populations than Vermont. And while total cumulative emissions overall tell one really important story, we can look at it on a per capita basis as well, which allows for a more fair comparison between states or countries of different sizes, and because that accounts for differences in the population. So that is what is shown on this graph. And you can see Vermont here in green and the United States right to the left of Vermont. So what we found is that adjusted for population, Vermont's cumulative emissions are among the highest in the world, rivaling the United States, Germany, Canada, major economies within the EU. Sorry. All right, back to you, Jared.
Thanks, Lena. So, we always share a lot of data. We always look at the science, but this is not just a scientific question. This is really a social question. It's a question of how do we effectively act together. And so the other part of this research paper that we looked into is all of the social science research around the logic of collective action and how do we work together to accomplish large tasks. Many of you know all too well that many opponents of climate action in Vermont and elsewhere frequently say that no state alone can effectively respond to the climate crisis. And they use that as an excuse for inaction. Now, of course, it's true that no state or country alone can tackle this problem. But that can be said of every state and country. So the response should really be that that is cause for stepping up to do our part, rather than an excuse to step back and shirk responsibility. Because we know that effective climate action requires collective action, with all of us doing our part where and when we can. And that includes taking responsibility for the pollution that we create here in Vermont and acting to reduce it at the scale and pace that we've committed to with science-based targets. We really like this image of a barn raising because this has happened throughout Vermont history. We know this ethic of when there is something that is too large for one person or one family to do, we can come together to do things far larger than we could have thought possible. And a barn raising, I think, is a good analogy for what we have to do nationally and globally in response to the climate crisis. Because whenever any single person, state, country buys into that logic of we'll just shirk responsibility, we're not going to do our part, the load becomes heavier for everybody else, and somebody else has to take up the responsibility or the weight that we're letting go of. And there's also, as we see, a really important social dynamic here. It's not just about what is the actual, how much does that extra weight cause when you step away from lifting your part. It's also the social example and the risk of a domino effect if folks see their neighbors stepping away. And so as each of us step forward, that can reverse that and have a positive feedback loop of more people pitching in. So we want to go back to this graph. Really shows a lot of the data that is in the Agency of Natural Resources recent greenhouse gas inventory, which was published earlier this year. You can see here on the left, these are historical emissions broken down by sector. And then these are the legal obligations in the Global Warming Solutions Act for 2025 and 2030. And one of the things that was in this year's report or inventory from the Agency of Natural Resources was some projections of what we might expect emissions in those future years to be and how they compare to our legal obligations. I should pause here to note that these projections did incorporate some really important policy and rulemaking changes that have occurred recently, most notably the adoption of the Advanced Clean Cars and Trucks rules, which will help over time significantly reduce our emissions, especially from the transportation sector. That's a huge step forward. I should also note that these projections did not account for everything that was underway, including not the federal incentives available through the Inflation Reduction Act. So these were point-in-time projections. They will be updated as we go forward. But we know, and what the Climate Council has heard from the folks doing even more updated analysis than this, is that there are still significant gaps between the legal obligations, especially for 2030, and what any modeling is suggesting a business as usual track would have us on. So we know that there is much more that we need to do to meet this legal obligation, especially because I mean, 2025 and 2030 are really close in time. And any of you who've been involved in the policy making and implementation process know that to make an impact by 2030, we're 7 years from that. It takes time to craft policy, to implement it, to see effects coming out of it. And so these are both very relevant years. And having big gaps, significant gaps between our obligations in 2030 and what is projected in this previous analysis and even in the more recent analysis, that is a problem that we need to respond to. So this graph looks at 3 key years for our emissions. 2005 is one of the baselines for the Global Warming Solutions Act. 2020 is the most recent year that we have emissions data from the Agency of Natural Resources. I see Colin Smythe and Megan O'Toole from the Climate Office over there, Climate Action Office. They do incredible work producing and sharing data. And one of the things that we can see is this really steep decline that has already happened and is projected to continue in transportation sector emissions. Now, part of this is a little bit, this has to be taken with a grain of salt because this is the 2020 emissions in the transportation sector when we saw a lot less driving during the pandemic. But primarily because of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rules, we expect that even if it will go up, there have been increases in transportation sector emissions in 2021 and 22. We know this will go back up in the near future. Over the long term, as a result of that rule, the expectation is that by 2030, our transportation emissions will be down here. This really emphasizes the importance of clear, durable policy and regulatory action to send market signals and create confidence. It's a very different story right now in the thermal sector. We saw for the very first time in Vermont's history that thermal sector emissions, residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use, were larger than transportation sector emissions in 2020. Now, while part of that was likely due to the much lower than normal transportation emissions because of the pandemic, we look ahead to 2030, and that is something that the ANR projections show actually expect the thermal sector to be much, much larger than others in terms of the emissions. But here's a really important point. That analysis did not account for the potential impact of the Affordable Heat Act and the Clean Heat Standard. And if you do that, you can see that would be modeled here of thermal sector emissions being all the way down here rather than up here. We will not know whether or not this happens until the PUC rulemaking process continues and there is another vote of the legislature in the years ahead. So this is a big question mark in terms of where our thermal sector emissions will be. One new piece that we've added to the report this year, because it was coming up in questions so frequently, is we wanted to deepen the understanding of why electrification is such a powerful strategy to reduce climate pollution and reduce costs. So many of us, I think, are really aware that when we get off of fossil fuels for transportation and for heating and switch to using electricity for those purposes, we can significantly reduce emissions because we're using an electricity portfolio that is 90% fossil-free, the cleanest electricity portfolio in the country, no matter how you measure it. Yes, there is more progress that can and should be made and that we need to do, but already 90% fossil-free electricity in Vermont. There's a big benefit there to electrification for EVs and heat pumps already. But there is this second, much less understood benefit to electrification, and it's that as we use this more efficient modern electric technology, we can use far less energy for the exact same purposes. So here's 2 examples. In a gas car, when you put gasoline in it, the amount of energy from combusting that gasoline that actually results in moving the car forward is only 16 to 25%. It's incredibly inefficient. This is data from the fueleconomy.gov and the Department of Energy. vast majority of that energy input is lost to heat and other engine losses. In comparison, electric vehicles, 87 to 91% of the energy input results in actually moving the car forward. And so the same amount of energy results in 4 times more actual work coming out of it. It's a similar story on the heating side. Combustion technology is inherently limited by the rules, the laws of thermodynamics, right? You cannot exceed 100% efficiency. But with modern cold climate heat pump technology, because you're not generating energy through combustion, you're transferring it from the air or the ground, we can achieve efficiencies that are 3 or 4 times greater. And so this is the really important double benefit of electrification. Using, yes, cleaner electricity instead of fossil fuels, but also using 3 or 4 times less energy overall, because these technologies are so much more efficient at using energy to accomplish a task, whether that's moving or staying warm.
So now to turn more to the cost of energy at the household level. In this year's report, we did update and expand upon some of our previous analyses related to energy burden and equity. We know that within the last few years, households throughout Vermont have felt the impacts of high fuel costs and particularly volatile prices. However, as we know, these impacts are not felt equally by all Vermonters. Vermont households with lower incomes are disproportionately burdened by high energy costs and are more likely to experience energy insecurity. So this graph here shows household expenditures on electricity and heating fuels on the one hand, so that's shown in blue there, and energy burdens associated with those expenses on the other, and that is shown in orange. So despite using less energy on average, and therefore spending less each year on electricity and fuel, Vermont households with lower incomes tend to face much higher energy burdens than those with higher incomes. And you can see that on this graph, that households on the far left here that earn less than 60% of the state median income spend an average of 19% of their income on these fuel costs. Thank you. And this compares to only 3% for those who earn at least 120% of the state median income, which you can see over here in orange on the far right. And the data shown here only include the fuel costs, and that's not to mention all of the additional costs that are associated with heating and powering homes, such as the equipment purchase and maintenance. And on the transportation side, we were able to look at the all-in cost of transportation, so that would be inclusive of the vehicle purchase, operation, and maintenance. And we can see that here on this slide. So both of these graphs do include not just the fuel that's needed to power a vehicle, but also the all-in costs of transportation. And although we didn't have the same level of data to look at it at as granular of a level in terms of the income categories for this graph on the left side here, we are still able to see a similar trend with these two categories of income level. So we can see that those with lower income, so on the left side we see the 80% of the state median income, on average are spending 30% of their income on transportation costs. And that compares to slightly lower, 25% on average for those making right at the state median income. And then on the right side here, we can look at more of how energy burdens vary across geographic regions throughout the state. So you can see that some parts of the state, including the Northeast Kingdom, here and parts of southern Vermont, face higher average transportation burdens than other parts of the state. So average countywide transportation burdens range from just 19% on average in Cheney County to 31% average in Essex County. And as I briefly mentioned before, gas and diesel are higher cost and far more price volatile than electricity. So we can see that on this graph throughout the past 15 or so years. We can see these big swings in the orange and blue lines, which represent gas and diesel respectively. And then below there on the green line, representing electricity, we can see that it's much more stable, consistent pricing, and has consistently been lower for the last 15 years or so than gas and diesel. And in addition to that, there are EV rates that are offered by some Vermont utilities. So here we're showing GMP and EED in the bottom right corner. And you can see that those are even lower than the average statewide electricity costs. And this is shown on a dollar per gallon equivalent basis. So these EV rates can break down the cost of driving an electric vehicle even further. And then a similar trend can also be seen here in terms of the various heating fuels, which are graphed here in terms of dollars per million British thermal units of delivered heat. So standardized pricing across the different fuels. And you can see in the middle here, we have kerosene, propane, and fuel oil. And those, like gas and diesel on the transportation side, are far more price volatile than some of the other options. Particularly when you compare it to the cost of a high-efficiency electric heat pump, which you can see in blue. It's a little bit difficult to see, but it's this blue line here, which, like electricity on the transportation side, is much more stable and consistent. So these graphs are showing that really switching to electricity for transportation and thermal or heating can save Vermonters money over time and protect Vermonters from these large, often unpredictable price swings. And transitioning away from fossil fuels can not only benefit Vermonters at the household level, but it also has important benefits for Vermont's economy as a whole. So we know that 100% of fossil fuels that are used in Vermont are imported from out of state or out of the country. And because of this, when we use fossil fuels for heating our homes and fueling our vehicles, the majority of the dollars spent, as you can see on the left side, 76% of the dollars spent in 2022 end up draining out of the state's economy rather than staying here and recirculating in Vermont. And on the other hand, on the right side here, when we purchase electricity, it's essentially the reverse. So we can see that in 2021, 75% of the dollars spent on electricity in Vermont stayed and recirculated in the state economy. So essentially the opposite of the other. And I do want to note that the years are different on these two graphs, and that is because there is a bit more of a time lag on the electricity data side. And we just wanted to show the most recent data, so that's why we have 2022 and 2021 here. And last but not least, one of the biggest challenges Vermont is facing when it comes to the energy transition has to do with workforce needs. So when it comes to our climate and clean energy workforce, Vermont does start in a relatively strong position compared to other states. We actually have the highest share of workers in the clean energy sector per capita in the country. And the data shown on this graph it comes from the 2022 Vermont Clean Energy Industry Report, which is published each year by the Clean Energy Development Fund. And it shows that between 2013 and 2017, we saw pretty steady growth in the number of clean energy workers. You can see the totals kind of up here at the top, they're really tiny. And then between 2017 and 2020-ish, we saw that kind of level off until, of course, in 2020, there was a bit of a decline in employment as there was throughout the economy as a result of the pandemic. And then as of 2022, which you can see at the far right here, Vermont had not yet returned to its 2017 peak of clean energy employment. And this graph is also showing this dark green. If you can't see it, it's the percent of workers, or the number of workers that spent 100% of their time on clean energy. And then the light green is the remainder. So it's not that this jumped from 0 to 10,000 in 1 year, it's just that data wasn't available for those previous years. So that said, there is still a lot of work to be done. In order to achieve Vermont's climate and energy commitments, we will need to attract more workers into the climate and clean energy workforce. And this has not proven easy. So clean energy workers in Vermont have been encountering increasing difficulty in hiring workers over the past few years. So on this graph, you can see between 2016 and 2022, the percent of clean energy employers who reported hiring difficulties. And we can see that percent who reported that it was very difficult to hire workers, that's shown at the top in red, has been steadily increasing. So more than half of these employers in 2022 reported that it was very difficult. And then the blue is showing somewhat difficult. So the vast majority are reporting some level of difficulty in hiring workers, whereas only 9% said that it was not at all difficult to hire workers in 2022.
So thanks, Lena. Beyond these brief key findings that we've shared, there's much more in the report. We hope you'll dig into it. As soon as we kind of finish one annual report, we start looking ahead to the next one. So we always want to hear your constructive feedback. What questions do you have? What new opportunities for analysis? Don't ever hesitate to reach out to us to share that with us. But in the meantime, we also want to make sure that the information here is really helping ground and inform and advance energy and climate conversations all over the state. That's why we do this, to make sure that these conversations are happening in an evidence-based, fact-based way. There is a lot of information swirling around. Some of it's true, some of it's not. So we go through a really rigorous process to try to help make sure that we can ground the conversations happening in the state in the latest and highest quality available data. So we would love to have conversations with your organizations, businesses, networks, communities. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd love to schedule a discussion with you, a presentation and discussion. And if you have upcoming events where you'd like to hand out copies of the report, let us know. You can email Lena, and we will, with enough lead time, give you free copies